world full of mass production, this guitar was made to stand out from the rest, and it was an absolute headache to build. Let's go back to the very beginning of this thing so you can see just how much work went into making it. It all started with this nearly 1,000 pound chinkapin oak burl. Someone nearby had it for sale for only $200, and I decided to take the risk and see if it had any usable guitar tops in it. Problem was, I didn't really have the means to mill it or even move it around for that matter. I've only milled and dried my own wood once before, and there was something about this burl that just felt uncomfortable and familiar. Buffalo Soldier! I figured it would be easier to move around if it was cut into smaller pieces, which led me to my first issue. My chainsaw was extremely dull and crappy. It barely made a dent in this thing, but it was surely starting to piss off my neighbors. That's when my buddy Sean came over with his good chainsaw and a new blade to hack this thing up for me. If you can't tell, I live in a suburban neighborhood with neighbors close by in all directions. The darker it got, the more silhouettes I saw standing in all of their windows wondering why two idiots were revving a chainsaw after dark. Once it was at manageable sizes, I reached out to a local guy who owned his own sawmill and he got this thing slabbed out for me. Some of the grain pattern was something Zach Wilde would be proud of, but I also found a few usable guitar tops as well. My next hurdle was to get it dry, so off camera I was able to build a DIY dehumidifier kiln and cook these babies up for a few weeks. When I read the moisture content for the exact piece I used for this guitar, it was at a whopping 91%. I was able to get that down to 5%, which was probably a bit too dry. Here we are about a month later and I have this dried slab ready to turn into a guitar. Sean and I had the initial idea to just flatten this thing and make a playable coffee table with foldable legs. Although not practical, the idea was fun and worth giving it a shot. If you're new to my channel, you'll learn quickly I like to do things differently and make things that most people don't often see. There's no point in doing the same thing that's been on YouTube over and over again. Take this flattening jig for example. I didn't make it all fancy with 3/4 inch plywood and metal rails. It's made from the cheapest particle board I could find and I threw it together in about 15 minutes. I believe most jigs shouldn't take long to make or cost a fortune to build. Once you spend more than 30 minutes making it or spend more than $30, it's a handmade tool, not a jig, but that's not a bad thing. Chinkapin oak is a new species to me and I didn't realize how bad it smelled. I'm not joking when I say it literally smells like butt crack sweat mixed with a hint of cow manure. When flattening this thing, I wore a respirator more to block out the smell than the dust. Since this isn't furniture grade wood, I came across a lot of soft, rotted out areas. In fact, this whole slab became soft after I dried it. Instead of making it firewood, I cleaned out the rotted channels to prep for epoxy. I've been using epoxy more and more recently, especially for grain filling and stabilizing. But using a black tinted epoxy in this piece allowed me to get creative and make sure this wood wasn't wasted. I don't spend a lot of money on this liquid plastic either. I typically get the most affordable 2-part resin that's available online. From now until about halfway through the video, you'll see me giving into a bunch of intrusive thoughts in relation to design. I used half of this template to sort of etch out where I thought a guitar could potentially sit, but also leave room for cups and plates. While doing this, I noticed many of the portions were suspiciously soft, and I was worried about how it may hold up to the pull of the strings later on. I know in many of my other videos I've mentioned not changing out bandsaw blades because I hate it. But I started making guitar neck and body templates to sell on my website, so I switched my nice Resaw King out with a blade capable of making tighter curves. Then I left it on there, because I hate changing out bandsaw blades. I really had no idea what the overall design was going to look like at this point, but I knew I wanted to reserve as much of this piece as possible. And pro tip, pay attention to your workpiece before you knock your bandsaw blade off of the tires. If you remember, I mentioned this seemed suspiciously soft. When I started routing to the template, I noticed the router bit was pulling chunks out. It didn't bother me too much because this was definitely what I would call a rustic piece. In my opinion, rustic is synonymous with lazy and dirty. Who needs attention to detail when you can just Homer Simpson something together and call it a day? Speaking of attention to detail, instead of getting rid of the chainsaw mark, I rustically blended it together with a Dremel in a half-baked attempt to make it match the live edge. I started to get worried while drilling out the neck pocket. It went from suspiciously soft to me to realizing it was way too easy to drill into this. This isn't sped up. This is a dull Forstner bit drilling into oak, and that's a problem. Ignoring all red flags, I continued on routing out the neck pocket. At least I had my templates to do this. I gave away a set of these templates in my last guitar build video, and I'm happy to announce I'll be selling them on my website. I make all of these one at a time, so bear with me if you want one. It took a while, but I was able to get a perfect fit with the neck and the neck pocket. So all you have to do is flush trim your pieces and you have a perfect fit for a standard 25.5 inch or 26 inch scale length. It's perfect for those who haven't made their own guitar yet and want to give it a shot. What you see me doing here is stabilizing this with epoxy. I had the hopes it would soak into the wood and stiffen it up on all the soft parts, as well as grain fill. Believe it or not, this soaked up 4 coats of standard viscosity epoxy before starting to build on the surface. In essence, the idea worked and it was definitely stabilized, but I couldn't get over the feeling of uncomfortable familiarity. I set this to the side to work on the neck. I milled up this maple 3 years ago with my buddy Kyle, who is actually Sean's older brother, and it's been air drying ever since. I didn't know what I was doing, so it may have gotten a tad bit wonky. It was so warped I couldn't even cut it safely on the bandsaw, and my jigsaw was having all sorts of trouble following the bends. This maple actually came from a fallen tree in my mom's front yard. I was newer to woodworking then, and she asked me if I wanted it. Of course I did. It was small enough to mill on my bandsaw, so that's what Kyle and I did. Then I let it sit with a fan on it for 3 years in my basement, unfortunately without any tie downs to keep it flat. Luckily, I didn't need the entirety of each board as I was going to do a laminated neck, and I had some Spanish cedar lying around that would fit perfectly. And after some quick milling, this is what I came up with. I think the Spanish cedar added a nice color contrast that matched the body quite well. It sort of tied everything together rather than just a super light colored maple neck. While I was gluing this up, I got to thinking about the guitar body again, and something still didn't feel quite right. I set this aside and started staring at the coffee table monstrosity again. I couldn't shake this feeling that something looked so off, and tasty at the same time. There was a good guitar hiding in there somewhere, and I believe I found it. Voila! I noticed the grain on this portion followed the shape of a guitar perfectly and couldn't pass up the opportunity to capitalize on that. It left this perfect live edge along the bottom and everything just felt right after cutting this out. Another issue I faced was how thin the body was becoming. I started routing out the electronics pocket and noticed the hole was probably not going to be deep enough for an inset lid cover. And as you can see by all the extra dust, I was still dealing with a lot of soft, rotted out and stinky wood. I coated the body in another coat of epoxy to stabilize it and moved back to the neck. I had a truss rod left over from a damaged neck in a prior build. Even though it was slightly damaged, it worked well still, and I'm not a wasteful person. It's also a perfect 1/4 inch wide, making installing super simple with a router. I like contrast in a lot of ways, and I thought the Zerakote would be perfect to contrast from the neck. Problem is, I hate working with Zerakote. Its sawdust is what nightmares are made of. Freddy Krueger could successfully take me out in my dreams with a bag of this stuff. It's gummy and it sticks to everything. You'll see throughout the build where, after sanding, the dust just started to fill the grain in the maple, making it look dirty and rustic. I tried removing it with an air compressor, mineral spirits, and a high suction vacuum, and nothing worked. Although it's hard and stable, it's also extremely brittle and chips out and cracks easily. Needless to say, I don't see myself using it for many fretboards in the future. Sometimes beauty just isn't worth it, at least in this case. I easily shape the neck with this template I mentioned earlier. It's designed to perfectly fit to the body templates I make as well. I think I made the neck a bit too thick though. I was originally going to angle the headstock, which would have made sense at the thickness. Instead, I was able to save the scraps for a jig you'll see shortly. Most necks are 1 inch thick, including the fretboard, and the resawn portion here was about 7/8 of an inch, which would have been perfect to make another neck from. But I don't like making the same things twice, so a jig it is. Sticking with the rustic idea, I went with 1/4 inch poplar dowels for the fret inlays. I don't think I'll ever use standard fret inlays, and I try to do something different each time. That being said, this is the closest to standard you'll ever see me approach. I'm curious on different ideas for the fret inlays, or even guitar ideas from any of you watching. I'd like to stay outside of the box, so leave me a comment letting me know what you'd like to see in the future. It can be any crazy design you can think of. Maybe I'll even give it to you when I'm done. For the side dots, I used the cutoff neck to hold my workpiece level and at the drill press. I had 1/8 inch brass rod left over and thought it would be the perfect touch for the sides. Brass rod is something I think every woodworker should have in their shop. It works great for decorative joinery or fret inlays, and it's relatively easy to work with. Most woodworking tools cut and shape brass easily, at least with patience. The first time I ever used it was in a bar cart I made a while back before I knew how to make a decent YouTube video. It made such a difference in the final look and feel of the project, and I immediately stocked up on different shapes and sizes. I'll make sure to leave a link below to the brass that I use. If you use any of my affiliate links, it won't cost you any extra, but it'll give me a little kickback for referring you, so I'd super appreciate the support. And just like that, brass side dots. They still need a little cleanup, but you get the idea. Another reason I chose poplar dowels was how easy they were to install and flush up, making it quicker for me to get to the neck and shaping. Using my favorite trusty table edge bit, I started rough shaping the neck. Doing it this way gives you a clean, controlled, and even reference. I also personally like the profile that this bit provides. I'll leave a link to it as well. I may try a large roundover bit in the next guitar build, just to see and feel the difference between the two, but for now, this is why I like it. It allows me to focus my hand tool work on the transitions and not the part that needs to be as straight and clean as possible. Speaking of transitions, I pulled out my inner woodworker and hacked away at them with a variety of hand tools. The whole goal is to blend them nicely and for the neck heel to complement the neck pocket. This was mostly accomplished with a set of my favorite cheap rasps. The material removability on these things is insane for something under $30. Using my furniture background, I went with threaded inserts to attach the neck instead of screws. They look nicer and hold better, in my opinion. It's just another detail I think makes it more of a quality instrument. But who am I to say? This whole thing is overall rustic anyways. I've learned over the years it's best to properly prep for inserts. That doesn't just mean drilling the holes and praying they'll go in without breaking. You should slightly chamfer the edges deep enough for the inserts to be fully recessed and to help guide the thread tap. Then you should pre-thread the holes to prevent your installation method from breaking the insert, especially in hardwood. After that, chamfer it down just a little more to clean up any leftover chipping from the thread tap. If you follow all the steps properly, These inserts should set up nice and smooth but still hold extremely well. If you look close enough, you'll likely see something weird going on at the back of the headstock. I accidentally cut it too thin and the tuners weren't able to lock down to it properly. I took some leftover Cerakote from the fretboard and face glued it to the back of the headstock. It's different, but I think it turned out pretty cool. What are your thoughts? I've been gearing this channel more towards guitar-focused content. I'm not building just guitars. I'll be making amplifiers, guitar cases, guitar stands, and more. If that type of content scratches your itch, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. I feel like I'm getting better with each video and I'm happy making content that helps people get into the art of making guitars. Keep in mind, I'm also learning along the way. I am far from a professional. I'm exactly what the channel name describes, a hobbyist. My hobby just started turning into a passion project, which caused me to spend more on tools than my wife truly knows about. If she ever finds out, you'll know because I'll likely be on the run with all my tools packed up in a U-Haul. The point I'm trying to make is, if you've been wanting to make a guitar but have been intimidated or think you don't have the time, I aim to change that. You don't need to be Paul Reed Smith or Sam Maloof to make something beautiful. You just need to start doing it, with whatever tools you have at your disposal. If you've never made a guitar before and want to start the easy way, I'll leave a code in the description for a discount on one of my template bundles. That way, most of the hard stuff is made easy, and I'd love to share your work if you keep me updated with it. Once I got these frets polished up to rustic standards, it was time to start tidying everything up before adding finish. I didn't have all of the hardware in yet, so I could only do so much, but I needed to get this thing in some oil before it started to warp or crack. The epoxy soaking into it probably prevented all of that from happening anyway, but I didn't want to risk it. I still had to prep for the neck bolts, and I also did a test with the neck in place and found I needed to shape a cutaway for the left hand to shred the higher notes. This is where I was happy with the wood being so soft and workable. This rasp shredded through the body like a grater to cheddar cheese. I'll have to do some rethinking on this design to avoid cutting out so much in the cutaway. I notice SGs typically have the neck set really high to avoid this, which I'm not a fan of. I was still planning on making an inset friction fit lid for the electronics pocket, which I also had a template for. But I'll save you the wonder and tell you this was useless as the pocket wasn't deep enough. I had to remake a lid later on to sit on top of this instead. But I'll still show the process. I was hoping to use this burly cutoff from the cow-shaped coffee table. This template fits the lid perfectly into the cutout I designed. Now I'm going to sit back and let you gaze at this grain reveal. It's truly something to look at. I still wasn't happy with how weak the neck pocket felt, so I came up with the idea to decorate it with a reinforcement. I had just enough Cerakote left over to create a long, bracing back plate to install on the body. I figured some brass screws would add a subtle hint of class and contrast. Instead of purchasing a string-through ferrule bar, I used a cutoff of wingay to make one instead. The final steps to get this thing playable was the hardware. I reached out to EMG and asked for them to sponsor me. Once they saw how small my channel was, they were like, how about half off on pickups instead? And obviously I took the deal. I love EMG pickups. They're so easy to install because of their solderless system, and they have internal shielding, removing nearly all noise and interference from the output. Because of their easy to read diagrams and solderless setup, I was able to get this guitar ready to play in just a few minutes. Overall, I'm really happy with the lessons I learned from this build and the final product. I'm more than confident to move on to the next one. And one final thing, Sean and I finally decided a brand name for these builds, and it's Scarlett Guitars, inspired by the Scarlet Ibis. Thanks for watching.